We originally related our religious feelings to our natural environment. The tree, the fountain, the wind, the animal were the focus. We invested them with a formidable greatness and they became sacred. It used to be nature that imposed its evolutionary rhythm upon us. The relation between man and nature is not merely experienced and practiced in an obscure fashion, it takes on a status of stability, of consistency, which makes it a reality having its own laws and its orderly permanence. It used to be nature that determined certain social structures. Now it is technology. It used to be nature that meted out the raw materials. Now the crux is the technological processing. It used to be nature that required man to establish fixed laws of relations between objects and himself. Now, the objects, emerging from a constantly renewing technological action, are no longer so important. Man no longer lives in touch with the realities of the earth and the water, but with the realities of the instruments and objects forming the totality of his environment. He is now in an environment made of asphalt, iron, cement, glass, plastic, and so on. We know that from his very origins, man has tried to establish a system of nature. He has striven for both a system of relations, and an explanatory system. He has often gone awry, with magical or metaphysical explanations and correspondences, but each time, one system replaced another, until he formulated a system of rational relationships that are called scientific. This is precisely the same labor that we have attempted in this light emergence YouTube video, since one of the main dangers of civilization arises from the inability of minds trained in the natural sciences to perceive the difference between the economic and the technical. When man finds himself in an environment that is becoming exclusively technological, the modes of savage, economic or political thinking, which survives as such in man, becomes fairly useless. The old natural environment is not really abandoned in favor of the new technological one. Rather, the new one permeates the old one, engulfs it, utilizes it, but in order to become the phagocyte, disintegrates it like a cancerous tissue proliferating in an earlier non-cancerous one. At a certain level, culture and nature overlap, forming society, and a totality that becomes a nature for man. And into this complex comes a foreign body, intrusive and unreplaceable, the technological order. It does not turn society into a machine. It fashions society in terms of its necessities. The simplest visual example is the way the city world encroaches upon rural areas through the spread of the suburbs. Technique has become the new and specific environment in which man is required to exist, one which has supplanted the old environment, that of nature. This new technical environment has the following characteristics: it is artificial, it is autonomous with respect to values, ideas, and the state, it is in a closed circle. Like nature, it is a closed organization which permits it to be self-determinative independently of all human intervention. It grows according to a process which is causal but not directed to ends. It is formed by an accumulation of means which have established primacy over ends. All its parts are mutually implicated to such a degree that it is impossible to separate them or to settle any technical problem in isolation. The development of the individual techniques is an ambivalent phenomenon. Since technique has become the new environment, all social phenomena are situated in it. It is incorrect to say that economics, politics, in the sphere of the cultural are influenced or modified by technique, they are rather situated in it, a novel situation modifying all traditional social concepts. Politics, for example, is not modified by technique as one factor among others which operate upon it. The political world is today defined through its relation to the technological society. Traditionally, politics formed a part of a larger social whole. At the present the converse is the case. Technique comprises organizational and psychosociological techniques. It is useless to hope that the use of techniques of organization will succeed in compensating for the effects of techniques in general, or that the use of psychosociological techniques will assure mankind ascendancy over the technical phenomenon. In the former case, we will doubtless succeed in averting certain technically induced crises, disorders, and serious social unbalances, but this will but confirm the fact that technique constitutes a closed circle. In the latter case, we will secure human psychic equilibrium in the technological environment by avoiding the psychobiologic pathology resulting from the individual techniques taken singly and thereby attain a certain happiness. But these results will come about through the adaptation of human beings to the technical environment. Psychosociological techniques result in the modification of men in order to render them happily subordinate to their new environment, and by no means imply any kind of human domination over technique. The ideas, judgments, beliefs, and myths of the man of today have already been essentially modified by his technical environment. It is no longer possible to reflect that on the one hand, there are techniques which may or may not have an effect on the human being, and, on the other, there is the human being himself who is to attempt to invent means to master his techniques and subordinate them to his own ends by making a choice among them. Choices and ends are both based on beliefs, sociological presuppositions, and myths which are a function of the technological society. Modern man's state of mind is completely dominated by technical values, and his goals are represented only by such progress and happiness as is to be achieved through techniques. Modern man in choosing is already incorporated within the technical process and modified in his nature by it. He is no longer in his traditional state of freedom with respect to judgment and choice. To understand the problem posed to us, it is first of all requisite to disembarrass ourselves of certain fake problems. First, we make too much of the disagreeable features of technical development, for example, urban overcrowding, nervous tension, air pollution, and so forth. I am convinced that all such inconveniences will be done away with by the ongoing evolution of technique itself, and indeed, that it is only by means of such evolution that this can happen. The inconveniences we emphasize are always dependent on technical solutions, and it is only by means of techniques that they can be solved. This fact leads to the following considerations. Every solution to some technical inconvenience is able only to reinforce the system of techniques in their ensemble. Enmeshed in a process of technical development like our own, the possibilities of human survival are better served by more technique than less, a fact which contributes nothing, however, to the resolution of the basic problem. Second, we hear too often that morals are being threatened by the growth of our techniques. For example, we hear of greater moral decadence in those environments most directly affected technically, say, in working-class or urbanized environments. We hear, too, of familial disintegration as a function of techniques. The falseness of this problem consists in contrasting the technological environment with the moral values inculcated by society itself. The presumed opposition between ethical issues and technological systematics probably at the present is, and certainly in the long run will be, false. The traditional ethical environment and the traditional moral values are admittedly in process of disappearing, and we are witnessing the creation of a new technological ethics with its own values. We are witnessing the evolution of a morally consistent system of imperatives and virtues, which tends to replace the traditional system. But man is not necessarily left thereby on a morally inferior level, although a moral relativism is indeed implied, an attitude according to which everything is well, provided that the individual obeys some ethic or other. We could contest the value of this development if we had a clear and adequate concept of what good in itself is. But such judgments are impossible on the basis of our general morality. On that level, what we are getting is merely a substitution of a new technological morality for a traditional one which technique has rendered obsolete. Third, we dread the sterilization of art through technique. We hear of the artist's lack of freedom, calm, and the impossibility of meditation in the technological society. This problem is no more real than the two preceding. On the contrary, the best artistic production of the present is a result of a close connection between art and technique. Naturally, new artistic form, expression, and ethic are implied, but this fact does not make art less art than what we traditionally called such. What assuredly is not art is a fixation in congealed forms, and a rejection of technical evolution as exemplified, say, in the neoclassicism of the 19th century or in present-day socialist realism. The modern cinema furnishes an artistic response comparable to the Greek theater at its best, and modern music, painting, and poetry express an authentic aesthetic expression of mankind plunged into a new technical environment. Fourth, one last example of a false problem is our fear that the technological society is completely eliminating instinctive human values and powers. It is held that systematization, organization, rationalized conditions of labor, overly hygienic living conditions, and the like have a tendency to repress the forces of instinct. For some people the phenomenon of beatniks and hooligans is explained by youth's violent reaction and the protestation of youth's vital force to a society which is over-organized, over-ordered, over-regulated, in short, technicized. But here too, even if the facts are established beyond question, it is very likely that a superior conception of the technological society will result in the integration of these instinctive, creative, and vital forces. Compensatory mechanisms are already coming into play. The increasing appreciation of the aesthetic eroticism. The same holds for music like the new jazz forms which are escapist and exaltative of instinct. All these things represent a process of release which is finding its place in the technological society. In the same way, we are beginning to understand that it is impossible indefinitely to repress or expel religious tendencies and to bring the human race to a perfect rationality. Our fears for our instincts are justified to the degree that technique, instead of provoking conflict, tends rather to absorb it, and to integrate instinctive and religious forces by giving them a place within its structure, whether it be by an adaptation of Christianity or by the creation of new religious expressions like myths and mystiques which are in full compatibility with the technological society. Examples of such myths are happiness, progress, etc. The Russians have gone farthest in creating a religion compatible with technique by means of their transformation of communism into a religion. What, then, is the real problem posed to men by the development of the technological society? It comprises two parts. 1. Is man able to remain master in a world of means? 2. Can a new civilization appear inclusive of technique? The answer to the first question, and the one most often encountered, seems obvious. Man, who exploits the ensemble of means, is the master of them. Unfortunately, this manner of viewing matters is purely theoretical and superficial. We must remember the autonomous character of technique. We must likewise not lose sight of the fact that the human individual himself is to an ever greater degree the object of certain techniques and their procedures. He is the object of pedagogical techniques, psychotechniques, vocational guidance testing, personality and intelligence testing, industrial and group aptitude testing, and so on. In these cases, and in countless others, most men are treated as a collection of objects. But, it might be objected, these techniques are exploited by other men, and the exploiters at least remain masters. In a certain sense this is true, the exploiters are masters of the particular techniques they exploit. But, they, too, are subjected to the action of yet other techniques, as, for example, propaganda. Above all, they are spiritually taken over by the technological society, they believe in what they do, they are the most fervent adepts of that society. They themselves have been profoundly technicized. They never in any way affect to despise technique, which to them is a thing good in itself. They never pretend to assign values to technique, which to them is in itself an entity working out its own ends. They never claim to subordinate it to any value because for them technique is value. It may be objected that these individual techniques have as their end the best adaptation of the individual, the best utilization of his abilities, and, in the long run, his happiness. This, in effect, is the objective and the justification of all techniques. One ought not, of course, to confound man's happiness with capacity for mastery with, say, freedom. If the first of all values is happiness, it is likely that man, thanks to his techniques, will be in a position to attain to a certain state of this good. But happiness does not contain everything it is thought to contain, and the absolute disparity between happiness and freedom remains an ever real theme for our reflections. To say that man should remain subject rather than object in the technological society means two things: that he be capable of giving direction and orientation to technique, and that, to this end, he be able to master it. Up to the present he has been able to do neither. As to the first, he is content passively to participate in technical progress, to accept whatever direction it takes automatically, and to admit its autonomous meaning. In the circumstances he can either proclaim that life is an absurdity without meaning or value, or he can predicate a number of indefinitely sophisticated values. But neither attitude accords with the fact of the technical phenomenon any more than it does with the other. Modern declarations of the absurdity of life are not based on modern technological efflorescence, which none, least of all the existentialists, think an absurdity. And the predication of values is a purely theoretical matter, since these values are not equipped with any means for putting them into practice. It is easy to reach agreement on what they are, but it is quite another matter to make them have any effect whatever on the technological society, or to cause them to be accepted in such a way that techniques must evolve in order to realize them. The values spoken of in the technological society are simply there to justify what it is, or they are generalities without consequence, or technical progress realizes them automatically as a matter of course. Put otherwise, neither of the above alternatives is to be taken seriously. The second condition, that man be subject rather than object, for example, the imperative that he exercise mastery over technical development, is facilely accepted by everyone. But factually it simply does not hold. Even more embarrassing than the question how is the question who. We must ask ourselves realistically and concretely just who is in a position to choose the values which give technique its justification and to exert mastery over it. If such a person or persons are to be found, it must be in the Western world, inclusive of Russia. They certainly are not to be discovered in the bulk of the world's population which inhabits Africa and Asia, who are, as yet, scarcely confronted by technical problems, and who, in any case, are even less aware of the questions involved than we are. Is the arbiter we seek to be found among the philosophers, those thinking specialists? We well know the small influence these gentry exert upon our society, and how the technicians of every order distrust them and rightly refuse to take their reveries seriously. Even if the philosopher could make his voice heard, he would still have to contrive means of mass education so as to communicate an effective message to the masses. Can the technician himself assume mastery over technique? The trouble here is that the technician is always a specialist and cannot make the slightest claim to have mastered any technique but his own. Those for whom technique bears its meaning in itself will scarcely discover the values which lend meaning to what they are doing. They will not even look for them. The only thing they can do is to apply their technical specialty and assist in its refinement. They cannot in principle dominate the totality of the technical problem or envisage it in its global dimensions. Ergo, they are completely incapable of mastering it. Can the scientist do it? There, if anywhere, is the great hope. Does not the scientist dominate our techniques? Is he not an intellectual inclined and fit to put basic questions? Unfortunately, we are obliged to re-examine our hopes here when we look at things as they are. We see quickly enough that the scientist is as specialized as the technician, as incapable of general ideas, and as much out of commission as the philosopher. Think of the scientists who, on one tack or another, have addressed themselves to the technical phenomenon: Einstein, Oppenheimer, Carroll. It is only too clear that the ideas these gentlemen have advanced in the sphere of the philosophic or the spiritual are vague, superficial, and extremely contradictory. They really ought to stick to warnings and proclamations, for as soon as they essay anything else, the other scientists and the technicians rightly refuse to take them seriously, and they even run the risk of losing their reputations as scientists. Can the politician bring it off? In the democracies the politicians are subject to the wishes of their constituents who are primarily concerned with the happiness and well-being which they think technique assures them. Moreover, the further we get on, the more a conflict shapes up between the politicians and the technicians. But it would appear that the power of the politician is being, and will continue to be, outclassed by the power of the technician in modern states. Only dictatorships can impose their will on technical evolution. But, on the one hand, human freedom would gain nothing thereby, and, on the other, a dictatorship thirsty for power has no recourse at all but to push toward an excessive development of various techniques at its disposal. Any of us? An individual can doubtless seek the soundest attitude to dominate the techniques at his disposal. He can inquire after the values to impose on techniques and his use of them, and search out the way to follow in order to remain a man in the fullest sense of the word within a technological society. All this is extremely difficult, but it is far from being useless, since it is apparently the only solution presently possible. But the individual's efforts are powerless to resolve in any way the technical problem in its universality. To accomplish this would mean that all men adopt the same values and the same behavior. The second real problem posed by the technological society is whether or not a new civilization can appear which is inclusive of technique. The elements of this question are as difficult as those of the first. It would obviously be vain to deny all the things that can contribute something useful to a new civilization: security, ease of living, social solidarity, shortening of the work week, social security, and so forth. But a civilization in the strictest sense of the term is not brought into being by all these things. A threefold contradiction resides between civilization and technique of which we must be aware if we are to approach the problem correctly. The first is that the technical world is the world of material things. It is put together out of material things and with respect to them. When technique displays any interest in man, it does so by converting him into a material object. The supreme and final authority in the technological society is fact, at once ground and evidence. And when we think on man as he exists in this society, it can only be as a being immersed in a universe of objects, machines, and innumerable material things. Technique indeed guarantees him such material happiness as material objects can. But, the technical society is not, and cannot be, a genuinely humanist society, since it puts in first place not man but material things. It can only act on man by lessening him and putting him in the way of the quantitative. The radical contradiction referred to exists between technical perfection and human development, because such perfection is only to be achieved through quantitative development and necessarily aims exclusively at what is measurable. Human excellence, on the contrary, is of the domain of the qualitative and aims at what is not measurable. Spiritual values cannot evolve as a function of material improvement. The transition from the technically quantitative to the humanly qualitative is an impossible one. In our times, technical growth monopolizes all human forces, passions, intelligences, and virtues in such a way that it is in practice nigh impossible to seek and find anywhere any distinctively human excellence. And if this search is impossible, there cannot be any civilization in the proper sense of the term. The second contradiction is that technical growth leads to a growth of power in the sense of technical means incomparably more effective than anything ever before invented, power which has as its object only power, in the widest sense of the word. The possibility of action becomes limitless and absolute. For example, we are confronted for the first time with the possibility of the annihilation of all life on Earth, since we have the means to accomplish it. In every sphere of action we are faced with just such absolute possibilities. Again, by way of example, governmental techniques, which amalgamate organizational, psychological, and police techniques, tend to lend to government absolute powers. And here I must emphasize a great law which I believe to be essential to the comprehension of the world in which we live, that is to say, that when power becomes absolute, values disappear. When man is able to accomplish anything at all, there is no value which can be proposed to him. When the means of action are absolute, no goal of action is imaginable. Power eliminates, in proportion to its growth, the boundary between good and evil, between the just and the unjust. We are familiar enough with this phenomenon in totalitarian societies. The distinction between good and evil disappears beginning with the moment that the ground of action, for example the instinct of the proletariat, claims to have absolute power and thus to incorporate immediately all value. Thus it is that the growth of technical means tending to absolutism forbids the appearance of values, and condemns to sterility our search for the ethical and the spiritual. Again, where technique has place, there is the implication of the impossibility of the evolution of civilization. The fourth and final contradiction is that technique can never engender freedom. Of course, technique frees mankind from a whole collection of ancient constraints. It is evident, for example, that it liberates him from the limits imposed on him by time and space, that man, through its agency, is free, or at least tending to become free, from famine, excessive heat and cold, the rhythms of the seasons, and from the gloom of night, that the race is freed from certain social constraints through its commerce with the universe, and from its intellectual limitations through its accumulation of information. But is this what it means really to be free? Other constraints as oppressive and rigorous as the traditional ones are imposed on the human being in today's technological society through the agency of technique. New limits and technical oppressions have taken the place of the older, natural constraints, and we certainly cannot assure that much has been gained. The problem is deeper. The operation of technique is the contrary of freedom, an operation of determinism and necessity. Technique is an ensemble of rational and efficient practices, a collection of orders, schemas, and mechanisms. All of this expresses very well a necessary order and a determinate process, but one into which freedom, an orthodoxy, and the sphere of the gratuitous and spontaneous cannot penetrate. All that these last could possibly introduce is discord and disorder. The more technical actions increase in society, the more human autonomy and initiative diminish. The more the human being comes to exist in a world of ever-increasing demands, fortified with technical apparatus possessing its own laws to meet these demands, the more he loses any possibility of free choice and individuality in action. This loss is greatly magnified by technique's character of self-determination, which makes its appearance among us as a kind of fatality and as a species of perpetually exaggerated necessity. But where freedom is excluded in this way, an authentic civilization has little chance. Confronted in this way by the problem, it is clear to us that no solution can exist, in spite of the writings of all the authors who have concerned themselves with it. They all make an unacceptable premise. This is, the rejection of technique and return to a pre-technical society. One may well regret that some value or other of the past, some social or moral form, has disappeared, but, when one attacks the problem of the technical society, one can scarcely make the serious claim to be able to revive the past, a procedure which, in any case, scarcely seems to have been, globally speaking, much of an improvement over the human situation of today. All we know with certainty is that it was different, that the human being confronted other dangers, errors, difficulties, and temptations. Our duty is to occupy ourselves with the dangers, errors, difficulties, and temptations of modern man in the modern world. All regret for the past is vain, every desire to revert to a former social stage is unreal. There is no possibility of turning back, of annulling, or even of arresting technical progress. What is done is done. It is our duty to find our place in our present situation and in no other. Nostalgia has no survival value in the modern world and can only be considered a flight into dreamland. We shall insist no further on this point. Beyond it, we can divide into two great categories the authors who search for a solution to the problem posed by technique. The first class is that of those who hold that the problem will solve itself, the second, of those who hold that the problem demands a great effort or even a great modification of the whole man. We shall indicate a number of examples drawn from each class. Politicians, scientists and technicians are to be found in the first class. In general, they consider the problem in a very concrete and practical way. Their general notion seems to be that technical progress resolves all difficulties with their appearance, and that it contains within itself a solution to everything. The sufficient condition for them, therefore, is that technical progress be not arrested. Everything which plagues us today will disappear tomorrow. The primary example of these people is furnished by the Marxists, for whom technical progress is the solution to the plight of the proletariat and all its miseries. into the problem posed by the exploitation of man by man in the capitalistic world. Technical progress, which is for Marx the motive force of history, necessarily increases the forces of production, and simultaneously produces a progressive conflict between forward-moving factors and stationary social factors like the state, law, ideology, and morality, a conflict occasioning the periodic disappearance of the outmoded factors. Specifically, in the world of the present, conflict necessitates the disappearance of the structures of capitalism, which are so constituted as to be completely unable to absorb the economic results of technical progress, and are hence obliged to vanish. When they do vanish, they of necessity make room for a socialist structure of society corresponding perfectly to the sound and normal utilization of technique. The Marxist solution to the technical problems is therefore an automatic one, since the transition to socialism is in itself the solution. Everything is for them resolved in the socialist society, and humankind finds therein its maturation. Technique, integrated into the socialist society, changes sign. From being destructive it becomes constructive. From being a means of human exploitation it becomes humane. The contradiction between the infrastructures and the suprastructures disappears. In other words, all the admittedly difficult problems raised in the modern world belong to the structure of capitalism and not to that of technique. On the one hand, it suffices that social structures become socialist for social problems to disappear, and on the other, society must necessarily become socialist by the very movement of technique. Technique, therefore, carries in itself the response to all the difficulties it raises. A second example of this kind of solution is given by a certain number of technicians, for example, Frisch. All difficulties, according to Frisch, will inevitably be resolved by the technical growth which will bring the technicians to power. Technique admittedly raises certain conflicts and problems, but their cause is that the human race remains attached to certain political ideologies and moralities and loyal to certain outmoded and antiquated humanists whose sole visible function is to provoke discord of heart and head, thereby preventing men from adapting themselves and from entering resolutely into the path of technical progress. Ergo, men are subject to distortions of life and consciousness which have their origin, not in technique, but in the conflict between technique and the false values to which men remain attached. These fake values, decrepit sentiments, and outmoded notions must inevitably be eliminated by the invincible progress of technique. In particular, in the political domain, the majority of crises arise from the fact that men are still wedded to certain antique political forms and ideas, for example, democracy. All problems will be resolved if power is delivered into the hands of the technicians who alone are capable of directing technique in its entirety and making of it a positive instrument for human service. This is all the more true in that, thanks to the so-called human techniques, for example, propaganda, they will be in a position to take account of the human factor in the technical context. The technocrats will be able to use the totality of technique without destroying the human being, but rather by treating him as he should be treated so as to become simultaneously useful and happy. General power accorded to the technicians become technocrats is the only way out, since they are the only ones possessing the necessary competence, and, in any case, they are being carried to power by the current of history, the fact which alone offers a quick enough solution to technical problems. It is impossible to rely on the general improvement of the human species, a process which would take too long and would be too chancy. For the generality of men, it is necessary to take into account that technique establishes an inevitable discipline, which, on the one hand, they must accept, and, on the other, the technocrats will humanize. The third and last example is furnished by the economists, who, in very different ways, affirm the thesis of the automatic solution. Forasti is a good example of such economists. For him, the first thing to do is to draw up a balance between that which technique is able to deliver and that which it may destroy. In his eyes there is no real problem. What technique can bring to man is incomparably superior to that which it threatens. Moreover, if difficulties do exist, they are only temporary ones which will be resolved beneficially, as was the case with the similar difficulties of the last century. Nothing decisive is at stake, man is in no mortal danger. The contrary is the case. Technique produces the foundation, infrastructure, and suprastructure which will enable man really to become man. What we have known up to now can only be called the prehistory of a human race so overwhelmed by material cares, famine, and danger, that the truly human never had an opportunity to develop into a civilization worthy of the name. Human intellectual, spiritual, and moral life will, according to Forasti, never mature except when life is able to start from a complete satisfaction of its material needs, complete security, including security from famine and disease. The growth of technique, therefore, initiates the genuinely human history of the whole man. This new type of human being will clearly be different from what we have hitherto known, but this fact should occasion no complaint or fear. The new type cannot help being superior to the old in every way, after all the traditional, and exclusively material, obstacles to his development have vanished. Thus, progress occurs automatically, and the inevitable role of technique will be that of guaranteeing such material development as allows the intellectual and spiritual maturation of what has been up to now only potentially present in human nature. The orientation of the other group of doctrines affirms, on the contrary, that man is dangerously imperiled by technical progress, and that human will, personality, and organization must be set again to rights if society is to be able to guard against the imminent danger. Unfortunately, these doctrines share with their opposites the quality of being too optimistic, in that they affirm that their thesis is even feasible and that man is really capable of the rectifications proposed. I will give 3 very different examples of this, noting that the attitude in question is generally due to philosophers and theologians. The orientation of Einstein, and the closely related one of Jules Romains, are well known, that is to say, that the human being must get technical progress back again into his own hands, admitting that the situation is so complicated and the data so overwhelming that only some kind of superstate can possibly accomplish the task. A sort of spiritual power integrated into a world government in possession of indisputable moral authority might be able to master the progression of techniques and to direct human evolution. Einstein's suggestion is the convocation of certain philosopher-scientists, whereas Romain's idea is the establishment of a supreme court of humanity. Both of these bodies would be organs of meditation, of moral quest, before which temporal powers would be forced to bow. A second example of this kind of orientation is given by Bergson, at the end of his work, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. According to Bergson, initiative can only proceed from humanity, since in technique there is no intrinsic will. Technique has conferred disproportionate power on the human being, and a disproportionate extension to his organism. But, in this disproportionately magnified body, the soul remains what it was, for example, too small to fill it and too feeble to direct it. Hence the void between the two. Bergson goes on to say that this enlarged body awaits a supplement of soul, the mechanical demands the mystical, and that technique will never render service proportionate to its powers unless humanity, which has bent it earthwards, succeeds by its means in reforming itself and looking heavenwards. This means that humanity has a task to perform, and that man must grow proportionately to his techniques, but that he must will it and force himself to make the experiment. This experiment is, in Bergson's view, a possibility, and is even favored by the technical growth which allows more material resources to men than ever before. The required supplement of soul is therefore of the order of the possible and will suffice for humans to establish mastery over technique. The same position, it may be added, has in great part been picked up by E. Malnier. A third example is afforded by a whole group of theologians, most of them Roman Catholic. Man, in his actions in the domain of the technical, is but obeying the vocation assigned him by his Creator. Man, in continuing his work of technical creation, is pursuing the work of his Creator. Thanks to technique, this man, who was originally created insufficient, is becoming adolescent. He is summoned to new responsibilities in this world which do not transcend his powers since they correspond exactly to what God expects of him. Moreover, it is God himself who through man is the creator of technique, which is something not to be taken in itself but in its relation to its creator. Under such conditions, it is clear that technique is neither evil nor fraught with evil consequences. On the contrary, it is good and cannot be dangerous to men. It can only become evil to the extent that man turns from God. It is a danger only if its true nature is misapprehended. All the errors and problems visible in today's world result uniquely from the fact that man no longer recognizes his vocation as God's collaborator. If man ceases to adore the creature, that is to say, technique, in order to adore the true God, if he turns technique to God and to his service, the problems must disappear. All of this is considered the more true in that the world transformed by technical activity must become the point of departure and the material support of the new creation which is to come at the end of time. Finally, it is necessary to represent by itself a doctrine which holds at the present a place of some importance in the Western world, for instance, that of Father Teilhard de Chardin, a man who was simultaneously a theologian and a scientist. His doctrine appears as an intermediate between the two tendencies already sketched. For Chardin, evolution in general, since the origin of the universe, has represented a constant progression. First of all, there was a motion toward a diversification of matter and of beings, then, there supervened a motion towards a higher unity. In the biological world, every step forward has been effected when man has passed from a stage of dispersion to a stage of concentration. At the present, technical human progress and the spontaneous movement of life are in agreement and in mutual continuity. They are evolving together toward a higher degree of organization, and this movement manifests the influence of spirit. Matter, left to itself, is characterized by necessary and continuous degradation. But on the contrary, we note that progress, advancement, improvement do exist, and, hence, a power contradicting the spontaneous movement of matter, a power of creation and progress exists which is the opposite of matter. For example, it is spirit. Spirit has contrived technique as a means of organizing dispersed matter, in order simultaneously to express progress and to combat the degradation of matter. Technique is producing at the same time a prodigious demographic explosion, a greater density of human population. By all these means it is bringing forth communion among men, and likewise creating from inanimate matter a higher and more organized form of matter which is taking part in the ascension of the cosmos toward God. Granting that it is true that every progression in the physical and biological order is brought about by a condensation of the elements of the preceding period, what we are witnessing today, according to Chardin, is a condensation, a concentration of the whole human species. Technique, in producing this, possesses a function of unification inside humanity, so that humanity becomes able thereby to have access to a sort of unity. Technical progress is therefore synonymous with socialization, this latter being but the political and economic sign of communion among men, the temporary expression of the condensation of the human species into a whole. Technique is the irreversible agent of this condensation, it prepares the new step forward which humanity must make. When men cease to be individual and separate units, and altogether form a total and indissoluble communion, then humanity will be a single body. This material concentration is always accompanied by a spiritual maturation of the spirit, the commencement of a new species of life. Thanks to technique, there is socialization, the progressive concentration on a planetary scale of disseminated spiritual personalities into a suprapersonal unity. This mutation leads to another man, spiritual and unique, and means that humanity in its ensemble and in its unity, has attained the supreme goal, i.e., its fusion with that glorious Christ who must appear at the end of time. Thus Chardin holds that in technical progress man is Christified, and that technical evolution tends inevitably to the edification of the cosmic Christ. It is clear that in Chardin's grandiose perspective, the individual problems, difficulties, and mishaps of technique are negligible. It is likewise clear how Chardin's doctrine lies midway between the two preceding ones. On the one hand, it affirms a natural and involuntary ascension of man, a process inclusive of biology, history, and the like, evolving as a kind of will of God in which technique has its proper place, and, on the other, It affirms that the evolution in question implies consciousness, and an intense involvement on the part of man who is proceeding to socialization and thus committing himself to this mutation. These different theories repose on a too superficial view of the technical phenomenon, and they are practically inapplicable because they presuppose a certain number of necessary conditions which are not given. None of these theories, therefore, can be deemed satisfactory. It does not seem that at the present we are in a position to give a satisfactory reply to the complex of technical problems. All that appears possible is to inquire into the above-mentioned necessary conditions for a possible solution. In any case, it seems that we can set forth the following thesis: the further technical progress advances, the more the social problem of mastering this progress becomes one of an ethical and spiritual kind. In proportion to the degree that man extricates himself from the domain of the material, dominates it, and multiplies thereby the means of exploiting matter, the problem ceases to be one of human possibilities and limits and becomes one rather of knowing which man, or group of men, will exploit technical means, and what will be the enabling moral and spiritual qualities. It is essential not to consider the problem resolved once this has been said. The current attitude is false according to which, once a matter has been pronounced a matter of morality, it is something simple and also automatically resolvable. On the contrary, the more a decision depends on a man or a group of them, the more difficult it appears, if we take a realistic view of the matter and refuse to admit a priori that man is good, democratic, liberal, reasonable, and so on. The difficulty resides first in that it is impossible to trust the spontaneous employment which men will make of the available technical means. Second, a man, as we have already indicated, is integrated into the technological process, and third, if we desire to preserve man's freedom, dignity, and responsibility, it is precluded to act upon him by technical means, like psychology, and so forth. To transform a man into a reasonable being and a good exploiter of techniques through certain psychological procedures is precisely to destroy him as a spiritual and ethical subject. We are thus caught in a dilemma before the decisive question, the question which may well be the penultimate one. With this preliminary, what are these necessary conditions? First, the first thing needed is a correct diagnosis and an effort to achieve a genuine consciousness of the problem. It is necessary to see the situation clearly and to pose the problem correctly if it be desired to know just what is to be done and if adequate answers are to be forthcoming. Inexact formulation of the problem affords no hope of getting a solution. The diagnostic element, on which I do not insist, must be accompanied by becoming conscious, by passing from the intellectual to the existential, which means that mankind must accept the fact that his existence is engaged and involved in this venture, and that his very freedom is at stake. It is necessary to become conscious of the fact that in every domain, technique has established stricter and stricter domination over the human being. But this consciousness must not be negative, no scientific determinism or divine fatalism before which man can only bow and confess himself unfree. On the contrary, it must be recognized that man's urge for freedom is subject to constraints and determinations which his vocation to be free must make him combat and rise clear of. But, to the extent that man clings to the illusion of the present that he is free, and uses the vocabulary of freedom, conceiving liberty as inalienable, or, to the extent that he holds to the conviction that all will be well though he sees that the technique actually diminishes the area of freedom, and dreams that possibilities of freedom still exist, in all these cases, his natural inertia is leading him to accept a condition of slavery and to pay for his technological happiness with his freedom. It is only by making men conscious to what degree they have become slaves and becoming happy, that there is any hope of regaining liberty by asserting themselves, perhaps at the cost of much sacrifice, over the technique which has come to dominate them. Short of attaining to such consciousness, there is no reason for any human being to lift a finger to secure mastery over his technology. Second, a second essential element consists in ruthlessly destroying the myth of technique, for example, the whole ideological construction and the tendency to consider technology something possessing sacred character. Intellectuals attempt to insert the technical phenomenon into the framework of their respective intellectual or philosophical systems by attributing to it a quality of supreme excellence, for example, when they demonstrate that technique is an instrument of freedom, or the means of ascent to historical destiny, or the execution of a divine vocation, and the like. All such constructions have the result of glorifying and sanctifying technique and of putting the human being at the disposal of some indisputable historical law or other. A further aspect of this element is the sacred, that is to say, the human tendency spontaneously to attribute sacred value to what so manifestly possesses transcendent power. Technique, in this view, is not solely an ensemble of material elements, but that which gives meaning and value to life, allowing man not only to live but to live well. Technique is intangible and unattackable precisely because everything is subject and subordinate to it. Man unconsciously invests with a holy prestige that against which he is unable to prevail. It seems to me that the only means to mastery over technique is by way of desacralization and de-ideologization. This means that all men must be shown that technique is nothing more than a complex of material objects, procedures, and combinations, which have as their sole result a modicum of comfort, hygiene, and ease, and that it possesses nothing worthy of the trouble of devoting one's whole life to it, or of commanding an excessive respect, or of reposing in one's success and honor, or of massacring one's fellow men. Men must be convinced that technical progress is not humanity's supreme adventure, but a commonplace fabrication of certain objects which scarcely merit enthusiastic delirium even when they happen to be Sputniks. As long as man worships technique, there is as good as no chance at all that he will ever succeed in mastering it. Third, a consequence of this is that, in practice, it is necessary to teach man in his employment of techniques a certain detachment, and independence with respect to them, and humor. It is naturally very difficult to accomplish this, and above all to get him to give up his illusions, not pretending to be completely free with respect to automobiles, television sets, or jobs, when the plain fact is that he is totally enslaved to them. Man must be capable of questioning at every step his use of his technical goods, able to refuse them and to force them to submit to determining factors other than the technical, say, the spiritual. He must be able to exploit all these goods without becoming unduly attached to them and without becoming convinced that even his most imposing technical conquests are to be taken seriously. Such recommendations must, of course, appear scandalous to contemporary eyes. To affirm that these things have no importance at all in respect to truth and freedom, that it is a matter of no real importance whether man succeeds in reaching the moon, or curing disease with antibiotics, or upping steel production, is really a scandal. As long as man does not learn to use technical objects in the right way, he must remain their slave. What I am saying refers to technique itself and not to the individual's use of individual techniques. These two problems are situated on different levels. But, if the individual cannot attain personal liberty with respect to technical objects, there is no chance that he will be able to respond to the general problem of technique. Let us recall once more that what we are setting forth are certain necessary conditions for finding a solution to this general problem. Fourth, everything we have said presupposes an effort at reflection which might be thought of as philosophic. If we admit that the technical adventure is a genuine novelty for the human race, that all that it has excogitated up to now can scarcely be of any use to it at the present, if we admit that it can only be by means of a fundamental and arduous search that we will be able to extricate ourselves from the mess we are in, a truly philosophic reflection will be necessary. But modern philosophic systems, like Existentialism and Phenomenology, have small utility because they limit themselves into cowardice with their assertions that philosophy in principle can have no purchase on technique. How, in the nature of things, can a philosophy which is nothing more than a research into the meaning of words, get any grip on the technical phenomenon? Preoccupation with semantics is the reason why modern philosophy immures itself in a refusal to come to grips with technique, as Dukas states, between the refusal of the philosophers, who claim to open up existence to themselves while evading the technical nature of the existent, and the hypocritical humility of the technicians manifested by an ambition stronger than their discipline, some very peculiar enterprises get underway, which might be termed pseudo-philosophies and pseudo-techniques, respectively, and which usurp in man the place of philosophies absent mediation. Authentic philosophy of real meaning would bring us to precisely that possibility of mediation between man and the technical phenomenon without which any legitimate attitude is inconceivable. But for such a philosophy to exist would mean that philosophy would first have to cease to be a purely academic technique with a hermetically sealed vocabulary, to become again the property of every man who thinks while he is engaged in the business of being alive. Fifth, finally, it is necessary to point out the importance of the relation between the technicians and those who try to pose the technical problem. None of the preceding is more difficult than this, since the technicians have become an authoritarian and closed world. They are armed with good consciences, but likewise with the conviction of their essential rightness and the persuasion that all discourse and reflection of a non-technical nature are verbalisms of no importance. To get them to engage in the dialogue or to question their own creation is an almost superhuman task, the more so that he who will enter this dialogue must be completely aware of what he wants, just what the technician is driving at, and what the technician is able to grasp of the problem. But, as long as such interchange does not take place, nothing will happen, since influencing technique necessarily means influencing the technicians. Dialogue can only come about by a permanent and basic confrontation between technique's pretensions to resolve all human problems, and the heroic will capable of escaping the limits of technical determinism.